Hello, I'm Brigantia Blackbird of Blackbird's Brew. Happy Friday. It's time once again for Romance in Modern Mythology. This week we are going to peer into the universe of Doctor Who and take a look at the relationship between the Doctor and River Song. Now, I picked this pairing specifically because their journey mirrored some of the patterns that we see in traditional fairy tales, in which we have a couple presented to us who, by all rights, should never really have gotten together to begin with. However, there were twists in fate and magic intervened, and everything conspired to where they were able to forge a bond and have an actual story and adventure. Now, if you are unfamiliar with this universe, I will very briefly explain. The Doctor is from a race of people called the Time Lords, and they come from the planet Gallifrey. And using a device known as the TARDIS, it enables them to travel through time and space as they will. Yeah, there's some rules here and there, but the rules are more like guidelines. And the Doctor Who, he's this very adventurous, curious person. He's very science-minded, kind of nerdy, very passionate about all of his convictions. He's always getting into trouble. He's always getting into the midst of something that he just didn't plan to get involved in. And River Song, she has a very complicated identity, as we will discuss, but suffice it for now. She's more of a female Indiana Jones. She shares the Doctor's sense of adventure, but she's a tad bit more aggressive than he is. They don't quite share the same standards about a lot of things, and yet she's just as drawn to him as he is to her, and we will get into more of those reasons later. But one of the big problems, and there are so many problems that this couple experiences, but one of the biggies that really made their story as much tragedy as it was triumph is the fact that their own personal timelines, because they're both traveling through time and space, their personal timelines are going in the opposite direction of each other. Think about that. This person who you're so drawn to and they drive you crazy in the best possible fashion and you just can't stay away from them, you can't have a normal relationship or interaction with them because you're meeting in the wrong order. Everything is constantly jumbled up. Their firsts are your lasts and vice versa. Quite a difficulty to overcome. Now, this is on top of the fact that the Doctor having romantic involvements is a relatively new development within the series. You didn't really see that in the classic series that ran through the late 60s to the... no, I don't think they quite made it to the 90s. But, late 80s, early 90s, that sort of thing. Quite a time period. You didn't really see the Doctor getting involved with his companions romantically. He always had companions around them. But it was usually, much more platonic, or he was more of a mentor, or things of that nature. There were one or two companions that, as you look back as an adult, you look at the series now and you think, I wonder if maybe the Doctor was slightly closer to that person. You don't know for sure, but, your thoughts do tend to lead in that direction. But it was never overt. It was never clearly stated, and it was never really enough for you to really build a case that, yes, definitely the Doctor did have a romantic relationship with this particular companion. Just isn't enough there. So when we get into the modern series, which had its reboot in 2005, I think it was, that's when you did start to see the series open up to the possibility of the Doctor actually having romantic relationships on the screen and seeing how those developed. There is always a big problem, though, is that because his species is so long-lived, and in fact, the Time Lords, they don't just travel through time and space, they are also exceptionally long-lived, and they're able to periodically regenerate. So that is essentially kind of like this rebirth, a renewal. It extends their lifespan far beyond that of an ordinary human's. So, on the occasions when he has fallen in love with someone who's mortal, well, he knows that even if that relationship lasts for the remainder of the other person's life, he still has centuries, if not millennia, of time stretched out ahead of him. So every relationship for him isn't in this way short term. It's very hard for him to, once he becomes attached, to actually admit it and pursue it because he knows it's going to end in pain, it's going to begin and end in the blink of an eye, and it just hurts his heart so much. And you can see him kind of fighting his feelings, even though he doesn't really stop him from getting involved with certain people. It's still, he's you can just see that he's kicking himself. He's like, why am I letting myself get set up for this again? Now, once the Doctor meets River, and of course he's meeting her at the end of her story with him, he knows that there's something a little bit different going on here. One of the big secrets with the Doctor is that no one knows his personal name. He's just the Doctor. And despite people trying to find out, and people asking him outright, and people trying to trick him into telling them, he keeps that personal. But when he meets River Song, and they're in the middle of this big emergency, and she knows all about him, and clearly he sees that there's some sort of history there between her and a future version of himself, and he just cannot get over this hurdle because she's really needing him to cooperate. And what she does is that she says, I'm sorry, but we don't have time for this. And she goes closer towards him and she whispers his name in his ear. And you can just see how his entire universe shifts. Because she later on says that there was only one time, only one reason he would ever tell someone his name. And of course, the implication was that the only reason he would tell someone his name is because he was married, and of course, it is his wife who knows his name. So he's looking at this person who, from his perspective, is a total stranger, but she knows his name, therefore he knows at some point in the future that's his wife. And you can just see the mental collapse in his poor head about what on earth is he about to get into that he doesn't know about. And come to find out, the character of River Song, she has this diary that she keeps of all of her adventures with the Doctor, but he's not allowed to read it because, spoilers, you're not supposed to peek into what's going on in the timeline because that can shift things, create paradoxes, and all kinds of other problems. But he still has it. So time goes on, and he begins to bump into her again and again, knows a little bit more. She's at different spots in her timeline, and he's just trying to figure out for sure what their relationship is and how it ultimately came about. And it's even more further complicated by the fact that River Song is actually the daughter of two of his companions. And here's where we get into where she's a little bit different than other human beings he's met and had dealings with. When River Song's parents got married, the doctor showed up, crashed their reception, invited them to come on the TARDIS, and he dragged them off to some other, fantastic honeymoon site. Well, that means their wedding night was spent in the TARDIS, and that just happens to be when River Song was conceived. And because of that, and because she absorbed so much of the TARDIS's energy, she wasn't born a normal human being. So all of a sudden, we have someone who ordinarily would have been human, but because through the magic of this science fiction world, she now has something close to akin to the near immortality of the Doctor. We see that she has regenerated a few times, so she has that same self-renewal, which means that the old problem of him watching someone that he cares about grow old and die is not exactly on the table anymore. She can go on like him. Even though they're moving in different directions, he knows that she can keep on regenerating, and he's not sure, how long she has before she ultimately meets her end. And so this automatically puts him in a very different emotional space. It's not just this, I'm going to close my eyes and blink, she'll be dead and gone. He's seeing that there's some time here. We could have adventures, we could have a life. There's all this sorts of stuff. He doesn't quite trust her, and for a lot of different reasons. River wasn't always the most trustworthy person, which led to a different problem because she was stolen as a baby by this weird cult, and the goal of this cult was to kill the Doctor. And they stole her when she was a baby, raised her in this really psychopathic way, and trained her as an assassin to kill him, which technically she did, but she ended up using her own regeneration energy to ultimately bring him back to life, and that's what sent her off in a journey to where she became someone else, had different goals. And you could just see how crazy it all was. By every rule in the book, you would not imagine these two actually getting past all of these weird roadblocks that, of course, in real life would never happen. But you see them, you would not think that this would be a situation in which, they would ever let down their guard with one another, ever get past the whole assassination thing, ever get past, all of these other issues. But they keep having adventures together, and you see how their relationship is just, who else were they going to fall in love with? She is the only one who's going to be able to understand how he feels about time and space, who can feel the tides of the universe the way that he does, and who has some shared experience with him, because she has one of the commonalities with the Time Lord. She could regenerate. That makes everything a lot different. And for her, on her side, she had been raised as an assassin and to fixate on killing him and all this and that. But he was literally the only constant she ever had in her life. And once she realized, after bringing him back, essentially, that, this wasn't someone that these people who had raised her had any business taking out of the picture. This was someone who was a good man. This is someone who she admired. This is someone who she had spent her entire life focusing on. And ultimately, who else was she going to fall in love with? So it is an interesting dynamic. And we see them, have their adventures together through a couple of the Doctor's regenerations. And you just sense that there's just a bond between them, a sense of a level playing field and equality that you don't really see between the Doctor and other previous romantic attachments. And it's all because of twist and fate, and because of the intervention of essentially the magical devices within that universe. And that's what makes their story so interesting and so watchable. Now, one of the reasons that I also wanted to bring this to the attention of everyone on my channel is because, believe it or not, modern-day practitioners of witchcraft and the Doctor, as well as River Song to extent, all have a similar problem. Both the Doctor and River Song were outside the usual flow of their societies. The Doctor had been an outcast from his own people for a time. He was on his own for different reasons in the series. He just wasn't really integrated and woven into the fabric of anything. And River Song, because her whole life was essentially wrapped up in him and her having her own adventures on her off time when she wasn't around him, they just were never quite in sync with everyone else. They weren't operating on the same wavelength. They didn't have the same job to do. There wasn't that common ground that ordinary people have with each other. And so too, as practitioners of the craft, we are a bit removed from society. Even if we're not around anyone who's hostile towards our path. I'm not talking about hostility. I'm just talking about the nature of practicing the craft and being someone who really views the world through a different set of eyes. I've discussed in other videos about how when you're practicing the craft, you start seeing all these different layers to reality that you didn't really notice beforehand. And even before you really started training, there's usually something a little bit different from you that puts you just a little bit out of sync with the other people in your life, even if you couldn't define why. And so that makes forging romantic relationships kind of difficult. We don't have the issue of traveling through time in the wrong direction as potential partners, but we certainly have the issue of how do you forge common ground with people who have different obligations than you do, from people who perhaps have no capacity for magic at all, may not even understand that it exists or believe that it does. It's a problem. It's a real problem. This is something that I only recently thought about in relationship with this story, is that sometimes what you really crave more than anything else is just someone who gets it. Someone who you do not have to go into a 5-page essay to explain why you're thinking or acting or doing what you're doing. You're not having to justify yourself to, you're not having to persuade them of anything. You have a shorthand because you're on a level playing field. And that's hard to find. It's really, really hard to find. Those practitioners who do have that with their partner, that's excellent. But there's a lot of people who never have that with their partner, and they're just trying to bump through life. But that's essentially why I brought the Doctor and River Song to our attention, is just because I think, in a way, in a twisted kind of way. I think a lot of us can relate. I think in a weird sort of way, it's the dream to have someone with whom you have that bond where all of the various obstacles don't really matter. All of the things that forbid a closer relationship ultimately don't matter. That you have a bond between yourself and that person that supersedes everything else, and does so to such an extent that, let the rest of the world burn because you have that person, and as long as you have that person, things are okay. It's a seductive dream. But we all need our fairy tales, don't we? And I think the Doctor and River Song are a fun one. That's it for today. I don't really have anything further on analysis on those two at the time. If you're also a fellow Doctor Who fan, please unburden your nerdy heart to me. Do you like this pairing? Do you like the Doctor with other particular characters? Do you dislike the Doctor in romantic relationships at all? Tell me all about it. It's been a long time since I had a good old chinwag with other fans of the show. But that's it for now. I'll see you in another video.